Hi, everybody. It's Daniel Karapkin speaking to you using the webyeshiva.org platform. We are here in Thornhill, Ontario at the Bayit Beth Avram Yosef of Toronto, and we're studying Maimonides' Guide for the Perplexed, Moreh Nevukhim. We've been doing so for quite some time, so we're now currently in section 2 of the guide, and we're about to begin chapter 29. Chapter 29 in the Shlomo Pines version of the guide is on page 336. Let's get our bearings and see where we are to date. What we've been studying up until now is the Rambam's thesis on the nature of our universe, its eternal nature. And the Rambam had told us that we can divide the concept of eternity into two parts. One is known as a parte ante, which means eternity going backwards in time, and a parte post, meaning you can go forward in eternity for all time. To suggest that our universe has eternally existed implies something problematic about God, that God necessarily and automatically emanates without volition or will in involving himself in our world, and that is theologically problematic. And therefore, the Rambam says that despite Aristotle's assertion to the contrary, that position is untenable. But when God created our world, he created it as a perfect, with a perfect nature. And due to its perfection, it must exist for all of eternity moving forward into the future, which is what we call a parte post. That's the Latin term for it. And so this has been what he's asserted up until now. In chapter 28, the Rambam has brought forward passages from Tanakh which seem to support that idea, especially from the book of Kohelet, Ecclesiastes, V'holam le'olam amadet. And now we're going to see a very lengthy chapter, chapter 29. It's quite daunting because it's so long. And so what we're going to try to do is to offer you a layout of this chapter, which has 8 basic sections to it. And we're going to try our best to cover this in the course of 2 weeks. We'll try to do the most of the bulk of the text this week, and then we'll cover the final material next week. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen with you. And for those of you who are not able to see the screen or are listening to this by audio only, this handout, if it's helpful to you, is available to download from the webyeshiva.org course description. If you go to webyeshiva.org, you can easily find a course description for Moreh Nevukhim and for chapter 29 in section 2. Or you can go to the Facebook community shiur in Moreh Nevukhim, and you can find the PDF there. So just to go over the main topic of our chapter, which is the Rambam is going to present us with various scriptures that seem to contradict this thesis of eternity a parte post. There are going to be many passages in Tanakh that seem to imply that the world at some time comes to an end, which would contradict what the Rambam is asserting. So the question basically of this chapter is, how do we reconcile scriptures that state that the world will come to an end? How do you reconcile that with my assertion, the Rambam's assertion, that the world is eternal? So the structure of chapter 29 is essentially this. This is our first part of our handout, and I hope that it's helpful for you. The Rambam is going to provide us with a preamble on understanding the language of the prophets. That prophets either speak in a language that is completely cryptic or in a language that is metaphorical for something completely different from that which is being described. Point number 2 is that the Rambam is going to tell us that Isaiah in particular, the prophet Yeshaya in particular, uses metaphorical languages when describing great downfalls or great prosperities. And he may talk about a kingdom that is going to rise or fall. And in the course of prophesying about a kingdom that is going to rise or fall, he will invoke images of the stars, the heavens, the earth shaking, increased light and renewal, and so forth. He'll talk about it in cosmic proportions, but you have to bear in mind that the prophet was speaking metaphorically, using a particular language that was unique to the prophet Isaiah and his own personality. And as a result, we have to learn not to take the words of the Nevi'im, the prophets, literally, and especially put them in their proper context. Point number three is where the bulk of our chapter, pages 337 to 342, where the Rambam will cite various passages from the book of Isaiah which challenge the thesis of eternity a parte post. Point number four, there will be a discussion of passages from other prophets which speak in metaphor. Point number five, there will be a discussion of a passage from our sages which speaks in metaphor as well. And then point number six will be, how do our sages deal with miracles in accord with our thesis? If we believe in the eternality of our world, why then are certain new things introduced into our world? And how then is a miracle miraculous? What defines what is a miracle? Because such a departure is predicated or is predicted in advance by the prophet. The Rambam is going to have a whole thesis on what exactly is a miracle, what it's not, and how it is reconcilable with the idea of a universe that by virtue of its perfection is eternal. Why then should there be new phenomena introduced into our world? Point number seven, in sum, the Rambam is going to maintain that the universe is eternal a parte post, but not like Aristotle, who believed in eternity also a parte ante, which presents theological challenges about our basic beliefs in God. And then the last point of the chapter is where the Rambam is going to be presenting us with sort of a preview of what he's going to be discussing in chapter 30. And he says that two preambles to chapter 30 are necessary. Number one, that these matters should only be studied by those who have already mastered science, and only then sparingly without revealing too much. And meaning that in chapter 30, the Rambam is going to be discussing the concept of Ma'aseh V'Reshit, the act of the creation, which is very esoteric and mysterious, and therefore needs to be revealed only to people who are already intellectually engaged and educated. And number two, realize that scripture uses words that are not at all meant to be taken in their literal sense. So that's a breakdown of the basic ideas of chapter 29. Now let's go into the text. Let's first look at the preamble of the Rambam. Let's take a look at it inside in the Pines edition on page 336. He tells us that, I want you to know that if one does not understand the language of a human being whom one hears speaking, one undoubtedly knows that the person is speaking, but without necessarily knowing what that person is actually saying. A person may be speaking to me in French. I have no idea what they're saying. Something of even graver import may occur. Sometimes one may hear someone else's speech in the language of the speaker, and the speaker speaks in a language that they understand, and their language indicates one meaning, and by accident, that word indicates in the language of the listener the contrary of what the speaker intended. Thus, the listener will think that the signification that the word has for the speaker is the same as its signification for him. For instance, and here he gives an example about the nuanced differences between the Arabic language and the Hebrew language. If an Arab hears a Hebrew man saying the word ava, now it's aleph, bet, hey, and even though in Arabic they would use the hard bet, and in Hebrew they would use the soft vet, but it's important to note that in the Rambam's time and in the where he lived, there was much less difference in sound between the bet and the vet. So a person who speaks Hebrew says the word ava, which means to desire or to wish. The Arab will think that he speaks of an individual who was reluctant with regard to some matter and refused it, because abi in Arabic means to refuse. And so it's quite ironic that the word ava, which appears several places in Tanakh, it appears 5 places in Chumash. So for example, Paro, in the story of being called upon to let my people go, the Torah says about him in Exodus chapter 10, Velo ava l'shalacham, that Paro did not wish to let them go. So the word ava means to wish to do something, and to say that lo ava means he didn't wish. But in Arabic, it means the exact opposite, which is abi, which means aba, which means to refuse to do something. Just as a linguistic aside, it's quite interesting that whenever you find the word ava in Tanakh, it always is used in the negative, lo ava. I think that's very telling in that it may have evolved from Hebrew to Arabic, that at some point lo ava turned into ava, which means the same thing as lo ava. But anyway, that's just an aside. But then he says, however, the Hebrew person only wished to convey that the individual was pleased with something and wanted it. This is similar to what happens to the multitude with regard to the speech of the prophets. And so sometimes we hear a prophet say something and we take their words without understanding the context and the linguistic style that they are using. And it's almost like a foreign language to us. So we hear the words, we think that they mean one thing when they mean something completely different. And then the Rambam says there are also times when the words of the prophet are so completely cryptic that we have no idea. We have no way of understanding what the prophet is saying at all, as it says but in Isaiah chapter 29, "Vatihi lachem chazut hakol ki divrei hasefer hechatum," that the vision of the prophet, that he sees everything, to you is like a sealed book, and that you don't understand what it means at all. But with regard to certain other portions of the prophet, people understand what the prophet is saying because they are able to put the words together, but they think that it means the opposite of what the prophet is actually trying to communicate. And for this, he brings um, uh, uh, another verse from this time from the book of Yirmiyah, chapter 23, verse 36. And you have this in your handout. V'hafachtem et divrei Elokim chayim, that sometimes you, the common folk, turn upside down the words of the living God. And he therefore says, know that every prophet has a kind of speech peculiar to him, which is, as it were, the language of that individual, which the prophetic revelation peculiar to him causes him to speak to those who understand him. So that's the preface. It's a very simple preface that we cannot take the words of the prophet necessarily at face value. And that ends point number one. Point number two of the Rambam is that Isaiah in particular uses metaphorical language. So let's continue reading because it's very straightforward text. After this preface, you ought to know that in the speech of Isaiah, peace on him, it very frequently occurs, whereas in the speech of other prophets, it rarely occurs, that when he speaks of the fall of a dynasty or the destruction of a great religious community or nation, he uses such expressions as the stars have fallen, the heavens were rolled up, the sun was blackened, the earth was devastated and quaked, and many similar figurative expressions. And there's even an Arabic saying, says the Rambam, that is similar to this. When a person falls to great misfortune, the Arabic phrase goes, his heavens were cast upside down upon his earth. Or, like we say in English, his world turned upside down. Now, we don't literally mean that the stars turned upside down and landed on earth, but it's a metaphor, right? In the same way, when he describes the prosperity of a dynasty and the renewal of happiness, he calls them an increase of the light of the sun and the moon, a renewal of the heavens and a renewal of the earth and so forth. That it's not to be taken literally, just as when describing the destruction of an individual or a religious community or city, they ascribe to God in relation to the latter the states of anger and extreme wrath. And we know that God is above all emotional states. And yet, a prophet will sometimes say that God's wrath is poured upon that nation. And when describing the prosperity of a people, they ascribe to God the states of joy and gladness, even though we know that God is not a being given to emotion, but those attributes, those emotional states are ascribed to God metaphorically because that's what seems to be occurring if we were dealing with a human being. And therefore, the Rambam gives various different examples of where we find in scripture these anthropomorphic terms that he had discussed so many times in the first section of Moreh Nevukhim, and where the Rambam had distanced those anthropomorphisms from God in his effort to make sure that we understand that God is a transcendent being that is above all of these kinds of emotional states. Just skip a couple of lines. Similarly, when a prophet gives information as to the destruction of the people of a certain locality, he sometimes, this is another metaphorical device that prophets use, is that sometimes when a prophet wishes to talk about the destruction of a particular place or a particular nation, he will sometimes substitute for the people of that locality the entire human species. And he will say, all of mankind will be decimated or all of mankind will be liberated, when he really is just referring to one localized nation. And you understand that based on the context. So, for example, Isaiah, peace be upon him. So he gives an example from Isaiah chapter 6, where it says, V'richak Hashem et ha'adam, v'rabah ha'azuva b'kerev haaretz. Clearly, he's making reference to the destruction of the Jewish people and their exile, but he uses the term Adam, which is a term for mankind. Mankind will be exiled from the land of Israel is clearly a reference to the Jewish people. Another example is at Zephaniah, from the book of Zephaniah, chapter 1, where again, we're talking about the destruction of the Jewish people or their exile from the land. And it says in that context, V'hichrati et ha'adam me'al pnei ha'adama. I will cut off mankind from the face of the earth. Again, not at all to be taken literally. So that concludes the second section of our chapter, where the Rambam is sort of introducing the idea that even though this is a phenomenon that occurs throughout Tanakh, especially in the book of Isaiah, we find the prophet utilizing metaphor of the earth shaking and the heavens moving when something dramatic occurs in world history. Again, not at all to be taken literally. So the first example, now we start section number 3, the lengthiest part of the chapter, where the Rambam gives us specific examples. So example number 1 is from Isaiah chapter 13, and the Rambam says this is in reference to the destruction of Sancheriv and later his successor Nebuchadnezzar. And he writes in the context of the downfall of these world leaders, he writes in verse number 10, Ki kochavei hashamayim uchesilehem lo yahelu oram, that the stars of the heavens and their trajectories will no longer illuminate. Chashach hashemesh bitzeito, that the sun has become darkened in its orbit. V'yareach lo yagia oro, and the moon will no longer give forth its light. Al-Kain, and then verse number 13, Shamayim argiz v'tir'ash haaretz mimakoma. I will cause the heavens to shake, and I will cause the earth to be displaced from its place. Now, none of those phenomena actually occurred literally, but it's like the heavens shook is basically a term that the prophet is using. And just a quote from the Rambam on page 338, I do not think that there has been anyone in whom ignorance, blindness, and the inclination to adhere to the external, to the most superficial, pashut pshat sense of figurative expressions and of rhetorical speeches have reached such a point that he thought that the stars of the heavens and the light of the sun and of the moon have been changed when the kingdom of Babylon came to an end, or that the earth was displaced from its place, as was stated. All of this is merely a description of the state of someone put to flight, for without any doubt, he sees all light as black, finds everything that is sweet bitter, and imagines that the earth has narrowed for him and that the heavens are closed over him. Now, of course, what is the whole objective of the Rambam in this chapter? It's to tell you that even though the verses in Tanakh describe cosmic changes and even a destruction of heaven and earth, that is not at all what it's referring to, because as I've demonstrated in the previous chapters, our world exists eternally for all time moving forward. And so any type of depiction of a destruction or any kind of change, dramatic change in the laws of nature are not to be taken literally. Next example that the Rambam gives is in reference to the humiliation of Israel at the hand of Sancheriv and the subsequent defeat of Sancheriv. This is all from Isaiah chapter 24. And just to cite for you some of the verses, He says, Ki arubot mimarom niftachu, vayir ashu mosdei aretz, that the heavens of above are opened and all of the foundations of the earth quaked. Noah tanua eretz kashikor, and the earth will shake like a drunkard. Again, v'chafra halivana ubosha hachama, that the moon will hide and the sun will be ashamed. And so what does this mean? It means that the literal reading is that there will be some kind of significant dramatic change in the laws of science, but that's not at all what it means. And then the Rambam quotes Targum Yonatan, the Aramaic translation of this text, in this last pasuk that we just read in pasuk Chaf Gimel in chapter 24, where it says that the moon will hide and the sun will be ashamed, is not referring at all to the moon and sun, but rather those who worship the moon shall be ashamed, and those who bow to the sun shall be humbled. And again, this is all metaphor. And Targum Yonatan supports that because he doesn't read the verse literally, of course, but there's no intent to suggest that there will be a change in the natural order of the cosmos. The next example that he gives is from Isaiah chapter 30, the increasing of light that will happen at a time when a righteous king like Chizkiyahu comes to power and suppresses all of the idolatrous nations and all of the idolatrous tendencies within the Jewish people. And therefore, to describe that, in chapter 30, verse 26, the verse reads, V'haya or halivana ka'or hachama, v'or hachama yihiyeh shiv'atayim ka'or shiv'atayamim. This pasuk may be similar to some, familiar to some. It says that the light of the moon will become like the light of the sun, and the light of the sun will be 7 times the light of the 7 days. Now, this is a reference, according to the Rambam, to the reign of King Chizkiyahu during the First Temple era. But then the Rambam asks the question, how do we understand that the light of the sun will be 7 times like the light of the 7 days? Like, why the number 7? So we'll get to that in just a minute. But let's, again, just to read a quote from the Rambam himself on page 339 in the middle of the second paragraph. He says, you will always find that when a great misfortune befalls a man, his eyes are darkened and the light of his sight is not clear, because the visual spirit is disturbed by the superfluity, by the excess of vapors, because of his depression, and also because his vision is weak, and there is not much of it in consequence of the greatness of the sorrow and the contraction of the soul. So therefore, people, when going through very, very sad or shocking situations in life, will sometimes have a compromise in their vision. On the contrary, when there is joy, when the soul expands outwards and the spirit is clear, man sees, as it were, that the light is stronger than it was. Now, the question, of course, that the Rambam asks now, how do we understand this multiple of 7 when it says that under Chizkiyahu's reign, the light of the sun will be 7 times like the 7 days? And what does the word 7 mean? 7 days. What is 7 days a reference to? So either it means simply multiplicity, because 7 is the pattern of a full week, and therefore to say that something will be 7-fold means that it will become full and robust. And then the Rambam says, but I believe his thesis of the Rambam is that it refers to the 7 days of the dedication of the temple, which took place during Solomon's reign, when there was no greater joy known to our people than that period of when they dedicated the first temple. And so essentially what the prophet Isaiah is suggesting is that under King Chizkiyahu's reign, the joy of the kingdom will be restored to the heights of joy that we experienced when the temple was first dedicated under King Solomon. Now, I just want to make an aside, even though it's not something that the Rambam raises, is that this verse is a verse that we allude to when we recite the prayer called Kiddush Levana, when we say a monthly blessing over the new moon. And we say a prayer. We say, V'hi ratzon milefanecha, may it be your will, O my God, lemalot pigimata levana, to supplement any defect that currently exists in the moon. There we are speaking outside in the presence of the moon. V'lo yihiyeh ba shum mi'ut, May the moon never have to suffer any kind of degradation or any kind of defect because it constantly is waxing and waning. We look forward to a time when the moon will be completely full. Vihi or halivana ko or hachama. We look forward to a time when the light of the moon will be like the light of the sun, uchaor shivat yemei bereshit, and like the light of the 7 days of creation, kemosha hayata kodem miuta, as it was before it was, as the moon was before it was diminished. And clearly, this is a reference to the verse in Isaiah when we say that the light of the sun will be 7 times like the light of the 7 days, making reference both to the light of the moon and to the light of the sun, that their luminescence will be restored to the way it was during the 7 days of creation. And then we quote the fact that during the 7 days of creation, the moon was in some way diminished from its original size. This is all based on Midrash, but clearly when we look at this verse and we say this prayer, there is a mystical undertone that we are alluding to, that in the Messianic age, according to some traditions, according to more Kabbalistic traditions, there will actually be a change to the natural order. And as the Talmud implies, the sun will be removed from its scabbard or filter. It will shine a light on the entire world, and the righteous will bask in it, and the wicked will be incinerated by it. Now, the Rambam is having nothing of this to be taken literally. All of this is all figurative. The sun will never change. The light of the moon will never change. Everything is to be taken literally. The Malbim, as a matter of fact, in his commentary on this verse in Isaiah chapter 30, verse 26, does hearken this idea to the number 7 being the 7 days of creation. But the Rambam is having nothing of that. The Rambam says it's really just referring to the 7 days of King Solomon's dedication of the original temple. Okay, let's go on to the next citation. The next citation of the Rambam in this section is from Isaiah chapter 34. And in Isaiah chapter 34, there is this reference to the downfall of the nation of Edom. And it says, "V'namaku kol tzeva hashamayim, v'nagolu kasefer hashamayim," that all of the hosts of heaven shall molder away, or shall melt away, and all of the heavens will be rolled up like a scroll. The chol tzeva'am yibol, and all of their hosts will wear out. And again, purely metaphor. And the Rambam then says at the conclusion of that citation on page 340, he says, "This is too clear even to be mentioned in a treatise like this, nor then should it be elaborated upon. But necessity requires this, for the common people, and even some of those who are supposed to belong to the elite, misunderstand it. They use this verse as a proof without considering what comes before it and after it, and without paying attention to the context in which it occurs, as if it contained information given to us in the Torah about the end of the heavens, just as there is given to us in the Torah information about creation. They mistakenly interpret this to be a prophecy about, just like there was a creation ex nihilo, so too will there be a destruction going from something back to nothing." And the Rambam says it is not, absolutely not true. The perfection of our world demands that it exist for all of eternity. According to Rav Kafich, the Rambam is clearly polemicizing against a known rabbinic opponent who is held in high regard but by the Rambam, but at the same time, the Rambam disagrees with him on this issue. Rav Kafich says he's referring to Reb Saji Gaon, who in his Emunot Videot does subscribe to the belief that based on some of these verses that we're citing, the world will eventually come to an end. Next citation, in describing the downfall of Sancheriv and all the kings who came to his aid in Isaiah chapter 51. It says in verse 6, "Ki shamayim ke'ashan nimlachu v'haaretz kabeged tivleh," the whole heavens will be smoked up and the earth will wear out like an old garment. In next example, in restoring the monarchy to Israel and ensuring its permanence and freedom from interference, the verse says, "Ki heharim yamushu v'hagavaot timutena," that the heavens may move and the hills may fall away, but my kindness to you will never be gone, says God. Another example from Isaiah chapter 65. The Rambam seems to be going in sequential order, going through various passages in the book of Isaiah. The verses in Isaiah chapter 65 that God says, Ki hineni vorei shamayim chadashim. I'm going to be creating new heavens, va'aretz chadasha, and a new earth. Veloti zacharnu harishonot, and the earlier times will never be remembered. They won't be remembered because of this new existence. Kihinini boreyet Yerushalayim gila ve'amat masos. Because why? Because I'm creating a new Jerusalem, says God, and its nations shall rejoice. Now, again, taken in context, it's talking about a restoration of Israel to their land, and they will be in a constant state of joy after having previously been in exile in a state of misery. Not anything having to do with a change in the natural order. And in promising, and finally, the final verse or final passage that the Rambam cites from Isaiah is from chapter 66, that God promises that the Jews' names will never be forgotten. Ki kasher hashamayim hachadashim v'arza chadasha, there will be a new heavens and a new earth, says God. But kein ya'amod zarachem v'shimchem, but you're just like they will stand before me, these new heavens and new earth. So too shall your seed and your names always stand before me, says God. And on the bottom of page 342, the reason why the Rambam says that the verse mentions both your seed and your name is because sometimes it happens that the seed remains while the name does not. For, he says, thus you can find many peoples that are undoubtedly the seed of Persia or Greece, but are not known by a special name, being absorbed in another religious community. This, to my mind, is likewise an indication of the eternity of the Torah, because of which we have a special name. Now that concludes the Rambam's discussion of citation of passages from Isaiah. But then in the next section, beginning on page 343, the Rambam enters into a discussion of passages that occur, sparingly in other prophets who speak in metaphor about, dramatic changes in the heavens and the earth. And he quotes verses which we're not going to quote today because I find it's going to become tedious after a point. But he quotes passages from Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Joel, Amos, Micha, Haggai, the book of Tehillim, Psalms, and the book of Shoftim, the book of Judges. And as the Rambam writes on the bottom of page 343 and top of page 344, there occur many passages of this kind. And he says, draw an analogy from what has been mentioned to what has not. And in particular, then, the passage in Joel, the passage in the book of Yoel, chapter 3, which talks about a dramatic change that's going to happen again of natural phenomena, the Rambam says the passage in Joel, in my opinion, refers to the destruction of Sancherib. But if you prefer, and apparently the Rambam is sort of conceding that there is another opinion as to what that passage refers to, other commentaries, presumably Reb Saadia Gaon and perhaps others, say that the passage in Joel chapter 3 is referring to a future messianic apocalyptic experience, the war of the destruction of the people of Gog and Magog. But the Rambam says it's fine if you want to interpret it that way, but there's nothing in the verse to indicate this. And as the verse says in Joel chapter 3, verse 4, Hashemesh yehafech lechoshech v'hayareach ledam. The sun will turn dark and the moon will turn to blood. And then it says, Lifnei Bo, before the coming of the Yom Hashem Hagadol v'Hanorah, the day of God that is great and awesome. And the Rambam says, yes, I know. People point to those words, Yom Hashem Hagadol v'Hanorah, that day of God that is great and awesome, saying that it's a reference clearly to a great messianic age, because why else would you call it the day of God that is great and awesome? That seems to be like like other, where we have in other prophecies. Hinei anochi shaleach lechem et Eliyahu hanavi lifnei bo Yom Hashem Hagadol v'Hanorah, that certainly is a reference to the messianic age. So is this not, this verse in Joel, a reference to a future messianic great metamorphosis that will occur? He says, no, it could still refer to Sancheriv, because every day of great victory for the Jews is called Yom Hashem Hagadol V'Hanorah, the day of God that is great and awesome. It doesn't necessarily have to refer to the Messianic age. Now, I want to point out just one, again, another aside. I know we're going a little bit longer than normal today, where the verse preceding the verse that talks about all of these changes is in verse number 3 in Joel chapter 3. It says, "V'natati moftim b'shamayim u'ba'aretz." I shall place Mophitim, wonders, in the heavens and in the earth, dam va'esh v'timrot ashan, blood and fire and pillars of smoke. This is a reference to the type of destruction that will take place either in the times of Sancheriv, when God brought retribution upon Sancheriv for the evil that he wrought against Israel, or it's a reference to the future messianic age that will take place against Gog and Magog. If this verse sounds familiar to you, it's because the Haggadah that we recite every Pesach quotes this passage from Joel in order to prove that the plague of blood, the first of the 10 plagues, was called a mophet, a wonder. Because in that verse, the word mophitim, wonders, is used to describe blood and fire and pillars of smoke. So we see that blood is a wonder. Now, why is that important? I refer you back to the Haggadah. There's a lot of commentary, but one of the commentaries simply says that the point of this passage of the Haggadah is just to indicate Moshe was sent to Paro to tell Paro that Mophitim, great wonders, are going to be performed. In other words, Paro, you have been duly warned, and it's a demonstration of God's compassion even to the enemies of the Jewish people. God brings warning to them before he brings utter annihilation to them. The Radak also, which we don't have time to go into today, also notes that there's a dispute on how to interpret this verse, and he quotes both the opinion of the Ibn Ezra, who says that it's a reference to the Messianic age, and he quotes the Rambam, who says that it's a reference to the historical destruction of Sancheriv. Now we're going to go to our 5th section of this chapter, and with this we're going to conclude. The Rambam says that starting on page 344 and going to page 345, the Rambam says that what you will discover from all of this is the notion, and I'm reading from the bottom paragraph on page 344, the notion toward which we are driving has already been made clear, namely that the passing away of this world, a change of the state in which it is, or a thing's changing its nature, and with that the permanence of this change, are not affirmed in any prophetic text, or, and this is the next part, in any statement of the sages either. In other words, the sages also may say things that imply that there's going to be this huge change to the world order, huge scientific phenomenal change to the order of nature. And he says, nothing in the words of the sages needs to be understood in that way. Of course, the famous quote that many are familiar with, including the Rambam, is the quote from Tractate Sanhedrin and in other places. Omer Rav Ketina. Rav Ketina said, Shit alfei shenei havu alama v'chad charuv. This world will exist for 6,000 years, and for an additional 1,000 years, it will be decimated. It will be completely desolate. Shenemar v'niskav Hashem levado bayom, as it says that on that day in the future, God will be exalted alone. In other words, there will be no one there to experience that other than God. So at face value, it certainly seems to imply, contrary to the Rambam, that this world will eventually cease to exist, because it says it'll only exist for 6,000 years and then it's done. So the Rambam says it does not mean that the world will be destroyed. First of all, it says that after the 6,000 years, there will still be something. So the world will not go back to nihilo. It will not go back to nothingness, just like it was when creation started, because after the 6,000 years, there will be an additional 1,000 years of God by himself. So that means that the world and its laws of nature will continue ad infinitum. just that there may be changes to the fact that maybe mankind may be wiped off the face of the earth, and maybe God will start all over again with a new creation, but not that he'll be creating a new ex nihilo, a world that is already perfect. Furthermore, says the Rambam, you have to appreciate that it is only the opinion of a solitary sage. It may be what we call in Talmudic parlance a da'at yachid, a singular opinion. It may not be the correct opinion. And furthermore, it should not be understood literally, says the Rambam, since it is meant to be taken metaphorically. It does not literally mean that the world will exist for 6,000 years, but perhaps what it means is that the world in its maturation process will need a 6,000-year period of maturation. And after that point, the world will have reached its point of maturity, and therefore mankind will no longer need to exist in his current state. But we don't know really what it means because it's to be taken metaphorically, and unfortunately, the Rambam does not share with us what the meaning of the metaphor is. But then he says, but there are other sayings of the sages that complement my thesis that the world will exist eternally based on the verse in Ecclesiastes, Ein kol chadash tachat hashemesh. There is nothing new under the sun. Now the Rambam quotes a medrash differently from the way it appears in our text. But the way that it appears in our text is as follows. Reb Yossi Haglili Amar. Reb Yossi Haglili says, Afilu otan shekatuv bahen, even about those periods where it says about them, like in Isaiah 65, which we saw above, Ki hineni vorei shamayim chadashim, I will create a new heavens, kevar hein beruin misheshet imei bereshit. Those worlds that God will introduce to the world, that new state of existence already exists. It's not that God will create something new in the future, but rather that it already exists in a different plane, perhaps, and God will introduce it to our plane of existence at some point in the future. Adahu dichtiv, and that's why it says in Isaiah, Ki ka'asher hashamayim hachadoshim v'haaretz hachadasha, like just as the new heavens and the new earth, haaretz chadasha in ktiv kan ela hachadasha. It doesn't say the new world, but rather the new world, meaning the world that has already been pre-existent because God already created it. Now, what's the Rambam's point? The Rambam is trying to point out to us is that there may be slight changes in the experience of man over the course of human history, but that nothing essential changes about the laws of physics, the laws of science. There's not going to be a dramatic change in the natural order. And I quote from the Rambam on the top of page 345, do not think that this is in contradiction to what I have explained, for it is possible that the prophet means that the nature that will necessitate in time the states of existence that have been promised was created since the 6 days of creation. And this is true. And this is true, says the Rambam. Now, in the Pines edition, he stops the paragraph there. But I believe that this is a lead-in into the Rambam's next topic, because I say that a thing does not change its nature in such a way that the change is permanent. Nothing in our world will ever change dramatically and permanently. There may be temporary changes, which I call miracles, says the Rambam, and there may be changes of the world order to make things better than they were, but staying within the current laws of the natural laws of physics. And this is the lead-in paragraph to how we understand the phenomenon of miracles. And this is where, my friends, we're going to have to close it for today. We've gone way over time. So we're going to conclude our chapter with the discussion of how the Rambam understands what exactly is a miracle if everything is perfect and there's no permanent change to our world. What is a miracle? Why do miracles occur? And how do they play a role in the Rambam's declaration that our world as it currently exists will always exist for all of eternity this way? So we'll hold it here for today, and we'll see you Be'ezrat Hashem next time. Take care now, everyone.